The heel of Margaret Hensley's stiletto struck the marble with such force that it echoed down the corridor like a pistol shot. No one asked the man's name. They saw only the creased jacket, the worn shoes, and the messenger bag that had endured too many airports. In the silence of Meridian Tower's executive floor, he looked out of place, like a misprint on polished paper. "Security!" Margaret barked, her manicured hand slicing through the air. "Remove him at once!" The strap of his bag slid from his shoulder. The flap tore open, scattering papers across the glistening floor. A boarding pass spun away and landed by Margaret's shoe. She ground the flimsy slip beneath her heel until it shredded. The man remained still. His stillness carried weight, as though silence itself was a shield. Behind Margaret, beyond the wall of glass, 8 executives sat around a mahogany table. Their reflections shimmered faintly in the glass, blurred but intent. The clock above them showed 9:47. 13 minutes before the meeting that would determine the company's survival. Margaret planted herself in the doorway, arms spread like a barricade. Her blazer stretched at the seams, her posture swelling with authority. "This floor is reserved for people who matter," she said, her eyes fixed on his scuffed shoes. He crouched, gathering his scattered papers one by one. Margaret's heel dropped close enough to clip his fingers. "Do not touch anything else," she hissed. He paused, looked up. His voice, when it came, was quiet and steady, the sound of someone accustomed to being underestimated. "I have a meeting here, 10 o'clock. She laughed, sharp and brittle. "You? This is Apex negotiation, executives only." Heads turned inside the room. Phones appeared in discreet hands. Through the glass, some executives leaned forward, curiosity stirring. Jennifer Cho, from marketing, slowed as she passed, coffee in hand. She hesitated, the weight of the moment heavy on her face. "Everything all right?" she asked cautiously. Margaret did not glance back. "Mind your business. This is a security issue." Jennifer lingered. Her thumb moved over her phone, the camera lens capturing Margaret's rigid stance. The stranger crouched among scattered papers. The live stream began, unseen at first. "You have 30 seconds, Margaret declared, loud enough for the conference room to hear. "Leave or I call the police." The man reached into his jacket pocket. The guards who had just arrived stiffened, ready. Margaret's hand hovered over the desk phone, her face tightening with suspicion. "Just my identification," the man said, producing a wallet. The leather was worn smooth by time. A card gleamed briefly, platinum, unmistakable, before he closed it again. Margaret faltered, then forced her voice louder. "Fake! All of it! Do not bother showing us lies!" Jennifer's stream ticked upward, 50 viewers, then 200. Comments scrolled fast. "What company is this? This is discrimination live." The elevator opened. David Grant, a senior manager with ambitions etched in every movement, stepped out. His tie was too tight, his expression pinched. "What is happening here?" Margaret lifted her chin. "This man claims he belongs in the Apex meeting." David's eyes scanned the man with a single dismissive glance. "The service elevators are down the hall, friend. Maintenance knows the protocol." The man brushed dust from the crumpled boarding pass. The faint letters caught the light. "First class, seat 2A, New York to Atlanta." The clock read 9:52. Inside the conference room, the chief executive checked her watch, irritation flashing. "Has anyone heard from Jonathan Reed?" she asked. "He is to lead this negotiation." "Perhaps traffic," the CFO murmured. The chief rose, voice firm. "We cannot afford delays." Margaret seized her chance, raising her own voice so it carried into the room. "You will not enter, not now, not ever." The man's phone buzzed. The screen lit with a name before he pocketed it. Jennifer's camera caught the flash, as did strangers watching online. Evelyn Ward, chief executive. 2 guards flanked him. They saw what Margaret saw, but something unsettled them. His posture was not nervous. It was erect, composed, as though he had stood in heavier rooms than this one. "Sir, identification?" asked the senior guard, Tom Delgado. Margaret cut across him. "Do not indulge his fraud. Remove him." The conference room door cracked open. Evelyn Ward herself stepped out, her presence cutting the tension like glass. She surveyed the scene with eyes trained to measure markets and men alike. "Margaret," she said, her voice even, "explain." "I prevented a vagrant from disrupting your meeting." The man's gaze met Evelyn's. A current passed between them, recognition stirring though she could not place it yet. Jennifer's viewer count surged past 1,000. Hashtags began forming. The marble, the scattered papers, the woman blocking the door, it all looked like theater and the audience was swelling. The clock read 9:59. The man reached into his wallet once more, this time with deliberate care. He produced a card, stark and elegant. Margaret snatched it before the guard could. Her face flickered with disbelief, then dread. The card read, "Jonathan Reed, Senior Partner, Apex Capital." The air constricted. Silence fell heavy, so complete that even the hum of the air system seemed to vanish. Through the glass, every executive pressed closer, eyes wide. Jennifer zoomed in, making sure her camera captured every letter. Margaret whispered, her voice frayed. Fake. Obviously fake. The clock struck 10 o'clock. The man finally spoke, his voice calm and precise, a blade sheathed in patience. "Then perhaps you should ask why the name on this card is the same name your chief executive has been waiting for." The silence was no longer silence. It was recognition taking shape, slow and undeniable. The corridor felt smaller after the words left his mouth. Executives pressed to the glass, their eyes hungry, while Margaret Hensley clutched the business card as if it might dissolve in her grip. Jonathan Reed stood motionless, his hands behind his back, his calm a contrast to the panic around him. Evelyn Ward stepped fully into the hall. Her presence carried weight not from height or force, but from the discipline of years spent negotiating at tables where billions hung in the balance. She studied the man carefully. Recognition was still incomplete, but something in his gaze tugged at her memory. Margaret found her voice again, brittle and unconvincing. "Anyone can print a card. Do not be deceived. He is lying." The live stream swelled to 3,000 viewers. Comments poured in, their words blistering, their judgments instant. The world beyond the marble floor already had its verdict. Jonathan did not look at Margaret. His eyes held Evelyn's. His voice carried a quiet firmness. "The meeting was scheduled for 10. It is now past the hour. We should begin." Evelyn did not move. She turned her head slowly, her eyes settling on Tom Delgado, the senior guard. "Did he show identification?" "He did, ma'am," Tom replied carefully. "I caught a glimpse. Looked authentic." Margaret snapped. "Do not listen to him. He is being fooled." Evelyn's gaze hardened. "Margaret, not another word." The authority in her tone cut sharper than glass. Margaret froze, her lips pressed thin. For the first time that morning, silence claimed her. Inside the conference room, Robert Lansing, the chief financial officer, opened the door. His voice trembled with urgency. "Evelyn, we are already behind. If Mr. Reed truly is Apex's negotiator—" Jonathan stepped forward, his motion steady but unhurried. Margaret flinched as if he had struck her, but he simply retrieved the card from her trembling fingers. He handed it to Robert, who read once, then twice, his face shifting from skepticism to horror. "It is real," Robert murmured. He lifted his eyes toward Evelyn, his voice almost a plea. "It is him." A murmur spread inside the glass room. Some executives set down their phones, their postures stiff with shame. Others kept recording, knowing history had already entered the corridor. Evelyn straightened, her voice low but cutting.
Mr. Reed, forgive us. Please come inside.
Margaret's chest tightened. She reached for words, for excuses, for a rope to cling to, but none came. Her silence was heavier than any admission. Jennifer Cho shifted her phone. Her live stream now showed Margaret shrinking against the wall while Jonathan passed into the room. Viewers multiplied. Hashtags solidified. Hat Meridian. Mistake climbed in real time. Inside, the boardroom was a study in luxury. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, the city skyline pouring light through tall windows. Jonathan took the head of the table without being invited. His presence filled the space, calm yet commanding. Evelyn closed the door, shutting Margaret out. Her voice, though controlled, trembled with the knowledge of what had just unfolded. Mr. Reed, let us begin. Jonathan opened his leather folder and spread a series of documents across the table. Each page was marked with precise tabs, highlighted figures, annotated forecasts. The executives leaned forward, hungry to escape the embarrassment outside. He did not start with numbers. He started with truth. Before we speak of terms, there is something you must all see. He reached for his phone, touched the screen, and the wall display came alive. Jennifer's live stream filled the screen, Margaret's voice ringing through the speakers. This floor is for people who matter. The recording played her insults, her orders, her laughter. It showed David Grant directing him toward the service elevator. It captured the guards hesitating while he stood still. The executives shifted uneasily. Some turned their faces away. Others could not stop watching. Jonathan let the video run until Evelyn raised her hand, her face pale. Enough! But Jonathan did not lower the screen. Not yet, he said quietly. The final clip played. Margaret's voice calling him a vagrant as the clock struck 10. Then silence. Only the hum of the ventilation remained. Jonathan's eyes swept the table. This is what your company presented to me before any negotiation began. This is what thousands have now seen in real time. Robert cleared his throat, his voice hollow. The damage, Jonathan interrupted softly, is not to me. It is to Meridian itself. Reputation does not recover easily. Once the world believes you are an institution that humiliates first and asks questions later, trust does not return. The words hung like smoke. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She wanted to speak, to regain control. But Jonathan's composure held the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence he left between words was heavier than shouting. Margaret stood outside the glass, her reflection faint, her body rigid with fear. She could hear enough to know her career was slipping away. Jonathan closed his folder with deliberate calm. We can discuss figures, forecasts, and capital injections. But first, Meridian must decide whether it is prepared to confront the truth of what happened this morning. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Robert's hand trembled as he adjusted his pen. David Grant stared at the table, his face drained of color. Evelyn inhaled slowly. What do you require? Jonathan leaned back, his expression unreadable. Accountability, transparency, and structural change. Without these, numbers mean nothing. The room sank deeper into silence. Jennifer Cho, still outside, ended her live stream. But it was too late. Thousands had already recorded, shared, and dissected every second. The story no longer belonged to Meridian. It belonged to the public. Evelyn felt the weight of it pressing down. She knew the company's survival depended on the man who had been humiliated in her own corridor. And she knew he was not simply a negotiator. His poise revealed something deeper, something not yet spoken. Jonathan's gaze fixed on her, and she realized she had a choice. She could pretend this was an isolated mistake, or she could admit the culture of her company had been exposed to the world. The clock ticked past 10:15. The negotiation had not even begun, but the real terms were already on the table. Jonathan folded his hands. "So," he said softly, "shall we speak about your future?" The question was not just for Evelyn. It was for every executive in the room, every employee watching online, every shareholder already bracing for the storm. Silence answered him first. Then Evelyn Ward, for the first time in her career, felt herself not as the one commanding a room, but as the one being judged. The boardroom had never been so quiet. Even the hum of the city beyond the glass seemed to pause, waiting. Jonathan Reed's question still lingered, the words balanced between invitation and judgment. "Shall we speak about your future?" No one rushed to answer. The executives shifted in their leather chairs, their eyes fixed on him, as if any sudden movement might break something fragile. The shame of what had unfolded outside the glass still clung to them, a film no amount of silence could wash away. Finally, Evelyn Ward leaned forward. Her hands were steady, but her eyes carried a sharp awareness. "Mr. Reed, you are correct. This morning's incident has created a crisis. Tell us what you require to proceed." Jonathan studied her face for a long moment before speaking. His tone was even, deliberate. "What I require is not apology, but assurance. Apologies fade. Assurances can be measured." He reached for the leather folder once more, sliding a page across the table. On it, 3 columns stood in neat print: accountability, structure, reform. Robert Lansing's eyes scanned the page, his lips pressing tighter with each line. This goes far beyond the scope of a financial negotiation. Jonathan's gaze moved to him. "That is because money is not the only currency being exchanged. Trust, reputation, and human dignity are on the line. Without those, no figure on any balance sheet will hold." The words struck harder than a raised voice. Robert lowered his eyes. David Grant fidgeted in his chair, his earlier dismissal replaying in his mind. "The service elevator is down the hall, friend." He could feel the weight of those words sitting like a stone in his throat. Evelyn tapped the page lightly with one manicured finger. "You propose external audits, diversity metrics, real-time reporting." Her voice carried no protest, only calculation. "You understand this will unsettle many within our institution." Jonathan's answer was immediate. If an institution is unsettled by fairness, then it was never stable to begin with. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with truth too difficult to contest. Margaret Hensley still stood beyond the glass, her face pale, her hands gripping her phone as if it were the only thing anchoring her. She watched as the man she had humiliated now reshaped the air inside the room she had once guarded. The realization pressed on her chest like a weight she could not lift. Jonathan adjusted the projector screen with a calm motion. Data appeared. Graphs, figures, burn rates. His voice did not rise, yet each word carried authority. "Meridian's reserves will not sustain more than 5 months at current expenditure. Without external partnership, solvency is improbable." Robert cleared his throat. "We are aware." Jonathan's eyes cut to him. "Awareness without action is negligence." Evelyn leaned back, the skyline's light catching the sharp line of her jaw. She studied him not just as a negotiator, but as a man revealing the company's vulnerabilities while holding his own composure intact. There was no arrogance in his voice, only precision, as though he had been preparing for this moment long before he set foot in the marble corridor. Jennifer Cho, though excluded from the room, kept refreshing her feed. She saw the stream's view count swell into tens of thousands. Screenshots had spread to news outlets. The story was no longer theirs to control. Inside, Jonathan closed the financial slide. He looked around the table, his eyes steady. This morning was not an isolated act of prejudice. It was the symptom of a culture. If Apex is to commit $300 million, it will not be to rescue negligence. It will be to invest in transformation. David finally spoke, his voice edged with unease. And if we refuse? Jonathan's response came without pause. Then Apex withdraws. Henderson Group will accept the capital, and Meridian will collapse within a year. Bankruptcy will follow, with layoffs measured in hundreds. The words hung like a verdict. No one argued. Evelyn's gaze flickered to Robert, then to David, then back to Jonathan. And you, Mr. Reed? What is it you intend? For the first time, he allowed the hint of a smile. It was not warmth, but a quiet acknowledgement of control. What I intend is simple. I intend to ensure that what happened in that hallway does not vanish into silence. Institutions change only when forced to face what they prefer to ignore. Margaret could hear every word. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to disappear, yet her reflection in the glass betrayed her presence. She had not been dismissed yet, but she knew dismissal was already written. Jonathan placed his hands flat on the table. So I will ask again, shall we speak about your future? Because I can assure you, the world already is. The executives shifted uneasily. Evelyn exhaled, steadying herself. She knew this was no longer about negotiation, but survival. Very well, she said finally. Her voice was calm, yet a note of resignation threaded through it. Tell us what must be done. Jonathan leaned back, letting the silence carry his authority. First, the individuals involved in this morning's incident must face immediate consequences. Second, the company must commit to transparent reform monitored by independent review. Third, Apex must be assured that Meridian's future will not be built on silence, but on accountability. No one spoke. The air was heavy with inevitability. At last, Evelyn nodded. Prepare the terms. We will review. Jonathan's voice cut gently but firmly. No. You will accept. There will be no review. There will only be compliance. This is not a negotiation over respect. It is a condition of survival. The words settled into the leather and glass, into the bones of every executive at the table. The power had shifted, completely and irreversibly. Outside, Margaret slid down the wall, her strength gone. She had spent years climbing floors of power, only to be undone in less than an hour. Inside, Jonathan folded his papers once more, his composure intact. Then let us begin. And for the first time, the executives realized they were not leading the meeting. They were being led. The weight of Jonathan Reed's words lingered in the boardroom long after he had closed his folder. Silence pressed down on every chair, every face. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone present understood it. What unsettled them most was that he had not raised his voice once. Authority had come through stillness. Evelyn Ward folded her hands, the polished diamond on her finger catching the light. She had led Meridian through storms before, but never had she felt so cornered within her own walls. Jonathan sat across from her with the calm of a man who had already anticipated every move. Margaret Hensley remained outside the glass, her reflection hovering like a ghost. She tried not to look inside, but she could not pull herself away. Her face was pale, her shoulders rigid, her phone trembling in her grip. Every few seconds she refreshed the feed as if hoping the video would vanish. It did not. It had already escaped her reach, circulating through networks and newsrooms. Jonathan tapped the folder with one finger. What begins today is not charity. It is accountability. You have until this evening to take the first step. Robert Lansing shifted in his chair. His voice carried the weight of decades in finance, yet now it sounded thin. And what, precisely, is that first step? Jonathan's eyes moved to Margaret through the glass. She froze, her breath catching. He let the silence draw out until it became unbearable. Then he turned back to the table. Immediate suspension of the individuals involved, transparent acknowledgement of the incident, and a commitment to external oversight beginning within 30 days. David Grant's voice cracked as he spoke. Suspension? You mean termination? Jonathan's answer was steady. I mean removal from positions of authority until independent review is complete. Consequences must be visible. Anything less is theater. Margaret swayed slightly, pressing her hand against the glass for balance. The word removal struck harder than she had expected. For years, she had believed her power untouchable. Now she could see it slipping through her fingers, not because of one mistake, but because the world had watched her reveal herself. Inside, Evelyn's jaw tightened. And if we comply? Then Apex proceeds, Jonathan replied. Funding flows, solvency returns, but only if the reforms are real. This is not a rescue. It is an investment in change. The room was quiet again. No one argued. They knew there was no leverage left. Jonathan rose from his chair, his movement unhurried. He walked to the window, staring at the city below. His reflection merged with theirs in the glass, a man who only hours ago had been mistaken for a trespasser. He did not gloat. He did not need to. Behind him, Evelyn cleared her throat. Mr. Reed, I will call an emergency session of the board this afternoon. We will initiate the measures you require. Jonathan turned back, his expression unreadable. See that you do. The meeting adjourned without fanfare. The executives filed out slowly, each carrying the weight of humiliation and the dread of headlines yet to come. Evelyn lingered, speaking quietly with Jonathan, but Margaret could not hear. Her own world was collapsing too loudly. When the door opened at last, the corridor filled with motion. Security guards escorted Margaret away, not roughly but firmly, the way one escorts someone whose authority has evaporated. Jennifer Cho stood near the elevators, phone still in hand. She lowered her eyes as Margaret passed, but not out of sympathy. It was acknowledgement of the end. Margaret walked with stiff legs, her dignity leaking with each step. She told herself she had only tried to protect the company, that she had mistaken him for someone who did not belong. But deep inside, she knew better. She had not mistaken him. She had judged him, and the world had seen it. By midday, the video had reached every major financial outlet. Headlines carried phrases like "Meridian in crisis" and "Negotiator blocked in viral discrimination incident." Stock tickers rolled with early losses. Commentators debated corporate culture live on television. The company's name was now synonymous with bias. Evelyn watched from her office, her phone buzzing relentlessly with calls from board members, investors, regulators. She silenced them all and focused on the figure seated across from her. Jonathan sat with the same composure he had carried all morning, his folder open once more. "You understand what you have unleashed," she said quietly. Jonathan looked at her evenly. What was unleashed already existed. I simply refused to let it remain hidden. The words pierced deeper than accusation. They revealed something Evelyn had avoided for years. She had known the culture was brittle, that voices like Margaret's thrived unchecked. She had chosen silence because silence was convenient. Now silence was no longer possible. Margaret sat in the lobby hours later, a cardboard box of belongings on her lap. She stared at the security desk where her access card had been disabled. The walls she once walked with pride now felt foreign, hostile. Her career had evaporated in the span of a morning. Jennifer passed by, her new promotion not yet official but already assured. Margaret lifted her eyes, searching for some recognition, some shred of sympathy. Jennifer only said softly, "We all make choices," before continuing toward the elevators. Margaret lowered her head into her hands. Upstairs, Jonathan finished the preliminary framework for reform. He laid out timelines, external auditors, anonymous reporting systems. Every measure was precise, leaving no space for evasion. Evelyn read them silently, knowing there was no alternative. When she looked up, Jonathan's eyes were waiting. "Meridian will survive," he said, "but only if it learns. This morning was not your destruction. It was your test." Evelyn nodded slowly. She had led through storms before. But this was different. This was not about numbers or markets. This was about truth, and truth could not be negotiated away. As dusk fell over the city, the lights of Meridian Tower flickered on one by one. Inside, a company stood on the edge of collapse and renewal, caught between shame and survival. Jonathan Reed remained at the center, a man once dismissed in silence, now dictating the terms of change. And beyond the glass, the world kept watching. By morning, the building no longer belonged to Meridian. It belonged to the headlines. Screens glowed in the lobby with news anchors replaying the clip. Margaret Hensley's voice carried across every channel. "This floor is for people who matter." The words replayed like an accusation carved into marble. Outside, camera crews camped along the sidewalk, their tripods planted like sentinels. Reporters shouted questions to anyone wearing a Meridian badge. Employees walked past with heads low, clutching their coffee cups tighter than usual. Some whispered. Some avoided eye contact altogether. All of them had seen the video. In the cafeteria, the clip played on phones at every table. The younger staff watched with unease, while veterans muttered about survival and damage control. Conversations ended whenever a manager walked in. Silence traveled faster than words. Jennifer Cho found herself at the center of something she had never intended. Her phone buzzed with messages of praise and criticism in equal measure. Co-workers thanked her for exposing the truth. Others accused her of betrayal, of airing the company's shame to the world. She carried herself with quiet steadiness, but her nights were restless. She knew she had altered the course of the company and perhaps of her own life. Upstairs, Evelyn Ward convened the emergency board meeting. The directors gathered with expressions carved from stone. Some had watched the clip a dozen times. Others claimed they could not bear to watch again. Evelyn spoke without flourish. "The choice is simple," she said. "Implement the measures Jonathan Reed has demanded, or collapse beneath the weight of this scandal. There is no third option." One director asked whether it was wise to let a single man dictate terms. Evelyn's reply was sharp. "He did not create this crisis. We did. He is merely refusing to look away." The vote passed, not unanimously but decisively. Reform was no longer an aspiration. It was survival. Margaret Hensley did not attend. She sat in her apartment surrounded by unopened boxes of flowers sent by friends who did not know what to say. She stared at the LinkedIn post her lawyer had drafted, an apology written in careful phrases. Her finger hovered over the button that would publish it to the world. She had read it 20 times, but each time she felt the words were hollow. No arrangement of sentences could erase what had been seen. She closed the laptop without pressing send. Jonathan Reed left Meridian Tower late that night without fanfare. No cameras followed him into the quiet of his hotel. He poured a glass of water, loosened his tie, and sat by the window overlooking the city. His phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations, outrage, requests for comment. He set it face down. For the first time since the morning confrontation, he allowed himself to exhale fully. But even alone, his expression did not change. Composure was no performance. It was who he had become through years of walking into rooms where he was measured by appearance before merit. He carried that weight the way others carried briefcases. He reached into his bag and withdrew a photograph. The edges were frayed. In it, his mother stood in front of a small house, her posture proud despite the cracked paint behind her. She had worked 2 jobs, endured quiet humiliations, and told him that dignity was not given but defended. Her voice echoed in his memory. Never let silence define you. The city lights blurred slightly as he stared at the photo. He returned it to the folder and closed it gently. Tomorrow would bring more cameras, more meetings, more demands. Tonight he allowed himself only a moment of quiet remembrance before the work resumed. The next day brought the press conference. Evelyn Ward stood at the podium in the lobby, the company's emblem shining behind her. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint. Maintenance had worked overnight to scrub the marble where the confrontation had unfolded. Reporters filled the space, their questions sharp, their eyes sharper. Evelyn spoke clearly, her tone solemn. What occurred within these walls was unacceptable. Meridian will not hide from it. We will confront it. We will change. She outlined the steps already in motion: suspension of those involved, engagement of independent auditors, the establishment of anonymous reporting systems. She named each measure with deliberate precision, knowing anything less would be torn apart by the cameras. Reporters pressed for details, for names, for consequences. Evelyn answered carefully, refusing to shield Margaret, but also refusing to make her the sole scapegoat. This was not the failure of one individual, she said. It was the reflection of a culture. That culture will be remade. Jonathan stood at the edge of the lobby, unseen by most, his presence deliberate but quiet. He did not step to the podium. He did not need to. His silence was louder than any speech. Across the city, employees watched the broadcast from their desks. Some felt relief, others skepticism. Many wondered whether change would last once the cameras moved on. Margaret watched from her apartment, curtains drawn. When Evelyn spoke the words, "Culture will be remade," she felt the final thread of her career unravel. Her phone lit with messages, but she did not answer. She finally pressed send on the apology post, then closed the laptop again. That night, Jonathan dined alone in a quiet restaurant. The waiter recognized him but said nothing. When the bill came, a note was tucked inside. "Thank you for standing your ground." Jonathan read it once, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. He walked back to his hotel through the cool night air. The city smelled of exhaust and rain, a mixture that reminded him of his first job, when he had carried files through crowded streets and been ignored by the very men he served. He thought of how little had changed and how much still could. As he entered the lobby, his phone buzzed again. A message from Evelyn Ward. "Tomorrow, the board wants you present as we formalize the reforms. Will you attend?" Jonathan stared at the screen. The decision had already been made. Still, he allowed the question to linger in the quiet of his room. He knew the reforms were not about him. They were about the next person who might walk into a marble corridor and be told they did not belong. He placed the phone face down once more, the city lights flickering across the glass. Outside, cameras still watched Meridian Tower, waiting for its next move. Inside, a man prepared not for victory, but for the long work of change. The first reforms arrived not with speeches, but with silence. Posters appeared in hallways overnight, bearing QR codes that linked to anonymous reporting portals. Employees arriving in the morning found the images pinned near elevators, break rooms, and even the executive floor. The message was plain. Dignity is not optional. Report violations without fear. For some, the signs sparked relief. For others, unease. The hallways buzzed with whispered questions. Would the system really protect them? Would the reports vanish into drawers like before? Or would they finally carry weight? Jonathan Reed returned to Meridian Tower that morning, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Conversation stopped as he passed. Some employees lowered their eyes. Others straightened, as though in his stillness they recognized something unspoken. He did not acknowledge the stares. He carried only a leather folder, the same one he had placed on the boardroom table. Inside the executive floor, Evelyn Ward waited with the board. She had aged visibly in the span of days, though her voice retained its steel. "The reforms are in motion," she said. "Now comes the enforcement." Jonathan studied the faces around the table. Some directors were resigned, others resentful. He saw the contradiction etched in their eyes. They wanted his capital, but not his conditions. "Enforcement is not optional," he said. His voice remained level, but the silence that followed was heavier than any threat. "If you delay, the cameras outside will not." Robert Lansing cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Do you not think the humiliation has been sufficient? Must we continue broadcasting our shame?" Jonathan turned his gaze toward him. "Shame is not punishment. Shame is recognition. Punishment is consequence. Reform is prevention. You are not finished until all three are present." The words settled into the room, undeniable. Outside the boardroom, staff lined up for the first mandatory training session. A consultant guided them into a conference hall where a projector displayed the title, "Bias and Assumption in Professional Conduct." The air smelled faintly of coffee and unease. Managers shifted in their seats, some already defensive, others attentive. Jennifer Cho sat near the back, her phone silenced. She felt the weight of eyes on her as though colleagues blamed her for exposing the company. Yet she also noticed glances of gratitude, subtle nods from those who had endured slights quietly for years. For the first time, she felt the possibility that her choice had not only altered the company, but freed something inside it. Margaret Hensley watched none of it. She sat in her apartment, blinds drawn, her career reduced to unanswered emails and a LinkedIn post drowning in comments. Strangers debated her life as if it were a case study. Friends avoided her calls. She wondered if the silence around her was punishment enough. She told herself she had protected the company, but the mirror told her otherwise. Back at Meridian, Jonathan walked the corridors unescorted. His presence carried no badge, no title on the wall, yet it bent the atmosphere. Employees whispered as he passed, some fearful, some curious. One young analyst, gathering the courage to speak, finally stopped him near the elevator.
"Mr. Reed," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you. People have been trying to raise concerns here for years. No one listened."
Jonathan paused, his expression steady. "And now?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Now they have to." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, then stepped into the elevator. He spoke no more, but the words lingered with her long after the doors closed. That evening, Evelyn sat in her office with Jonathan, the city's lights stretching beneath them. Her voice was measured, but fatigue threaded through it. "You realize they resent you," she said. Jonathan answered without hesitation. "Resentment is irrelevant. Compliance is what matters." Evelyn studied him, trying to read something deeper beneath the calm. "But why do you care? You could have walked away, taken the capital to Henderson, and left Meridian to collapse." For a moment, he was silent. Then he turned toward the window. The reflection of his face merged with the skyline. Because silence is survival for the individual, but destruction for the institution, someone has to refuse it. His voice was steady, but Evelyn caught the faint trace of weariness. It was not triumph he carried, it was burden. The next morning, the media returned with sharper questions. Commentators debated whether the reforms were genuine or cosmetic. Headlines split between praise for Jonathan's stance and criticism of Meridian's belated contrition. Protesters gathered outside the tower, some demanding firings, others demanding broader accountability across the industry. The city itself had become part of the story. Inside, employees filled out anonymous surveys. The responses came quickly, dozens within hours, some blunt, some fearful. Supervisors dismiss complaints. Hiring favors the familiar. Opportunities pass by those who are different. Each submission added weight to Jonathan's argument. The culture was not a matter of one corridor, but the entire building. In the boardroom, resistance surfaced. David Grant leaned forward, his frustration raw. How long must we endure this spectacle? We are financiers, not subjects in a social experiment. Jonathan did not raise his voice. You are wrong. You are subjects in your own survival. The experiment is whether an institution can change before it collapses. The room fell silent again. Even Evelyn did not contest it. Late that night, Jonathan walked alone through the city streets. The air was sharp with the scent of rain. He passed storefronts closing, taxis honking, the low hum of a restless metropolis. For the first time since the confrontation, he allowed his posture to soften slightly. He carried the photograph of his mother in his pocket, and his fingers brushed its worn edges. He thought of her words, "Never let silence define you." At the corner of Fifth Avenue, he stopped at a newsstand. Stacked newspapers carried his image on the front page, the headline declaring, "Negotiator turns boardroom into tribunal." He stared at it briefly, then turned away. He did not want to be the headline. He wanted to be the change that outlasted it. When he returned to his hotel, he placed the folder on the desk, opened it, and began revising the reform timeline once more. He knew enforcement would take more than documents. It would take persistence, vigilance, and the will to face resentment day after day. He worked late into the night, the city lights spilling across the page, and when he finally leaned back, exhaustion heavy in his bones, he understood that the real negotiation had only just begun. The reforms settled into Meridian like new bones in an old body, stiff and unwelcome. Posters hung on walls. Anonymous reporting portals flickered across screensavers. Training sessions filled auditoriums where managers sat stiff-backed, listening but not hearing. On paper, change had begun. In practice, resistance festered quietly. Jonathan Reed noticed it in the silence of the halls. Employees still lowered their voices when managers passed. Reports came into the portal by the dozens, but whispers reached him that some supervisors discouraged participation. "Handle concerns internally," they said. "Do not invite trouble." The words carried the same poison as before, dressed in softer tones. Evelyn Ward called him into her office one gray morning. Rain streaked the glass behind her. The city blurred into a watercolor of steel and smoke. "The board is restless," she said. "They claim morale is collapsing. They blame you." Jonathan sat across from her, calm as ever. Morale does not collapse when truth surfaces. It collapses when lies are left intact. Her lips pressed together. She admired his certainty, yet she envied it too. The burden of leadership had taught her that certainty was rare, fragile, and often costly. "I need results," she said softly. "Proof that these reforms are more than punishment." Jonathan opened his folder, sliding forward a sheet marked Preliminary Findings. In 2 weeks, complaint reports have tripled compared to the last fiscal year. That is not collapse. That is voice. Evelyn scanned the numbers, her eyes tracing the upward line. For the first time, she understood. Silence had never meant stability. It had meant fear. Still, resistance grew. David Grant gathered with sympathetic managers in hushed conversations. They grumbled about overreach and interference. One voice muttered, "He is not here to save us. He is here to humiliate us." They did not speak Jonathan's name loudly, but their resentment was unmistakable. Jonathan sensed it long before it reached him. He saw it in their eyes during training, in the stiff way they signed compliance forms, in the clipped responses to surveys. He had been in enough rooms to know when agreement was a mask, yet he did not confront them directly. He understood something Evelyn was only beginning to grasp. Resistance reveals itself in time, and silence can indict louder than accusation. Jennifer Cho, meanwhile, adjusted uneasily to her new role. She had been promoted to communications director, a title that brought both respect and suspicion. Some congratulated her. Others whispered that she had only risen by exposing the company. She bore it quietly, though at night she lay awake, replaying the moment she had lifted her phone in the corridor. She had not intended to change her life, but she had. Margaret Hensley lived in exile from the building she once ruled. She scrolled endlessly through news feeds, watching her name paired with words like bias and disgrace. She thought of applying elsewhere, but each attempt ended in silence. Her apology post had been dissected until it no longer belonged to her. Strangers judged her with a cruelty she had once reserved for others. Now she felt its weight every day. At Meridian, Jonathan pressed forward. He attended sessions, read every anonymous report, and met quietly with employees who had never before been asked what they thought. Many spoke cautiously, testing whether he was truly listening. When they realized he was, their words spilled faster, sharper. Stories surfaced of opportunities denied, voices ignored, judgments made before merit was seen. He carried those words with him into each meeting, laying them on the table without naming names. They were not anecdotes. They were evidence. But the strain grew visible. One evening, after 12 hours of back-to-back sessions, Jonathan returned to his hotel. He loosened his tie, sat heavily by the window, and stared at the photograph of his mother. The city stretched beneath him, indifferent and bright. For the first time, fatigue bent his shoulders. He had not come for admiration. Yet the weight of being the axis of change pressed on him like stone. He whispered her words under his breath. Never let silence define you. The mantra steadied him, but it did not lighten the load. The next morning, a new headline appeared. Meridian staff push back against reforms. Anonymous sources claimed morale had plunged, that employees felt policed and monitored. The article quoted unnamed managers calling Jonathan's presence a hostile takeover in disguise. In the cafeteria, employees debated in hushed tones. Some believed the article, others dismissed it. But the damage was real. The story of change now competed with the story of rebellion. Evelyn summoned Jonathan again. Her voice was sharper this time. You see? They are turning the narrative against us. I cannot silence the press. What do you suggest? Jonathan sat in his usual composure. Do not silence it. Confront it. Transparency is not your enemy. Secrecy is. Her brow furrowed. And if they refuse to adapt? Jonathan's eyes were steady. Then they will leave, or be removed. Change is not consensus. It is endurance. The words struck Evelyn deeply. She realized then what made him different. He did not need them to like him. He needed them to change, and he would endure their resentment until they did. That night, Jonathan walked alone through the rain-slick streets. Neon signs reflected on the pavement, blurring into rivers of color. He passed a newsstand where his face stared back at him, the headline branding him a disruptor. He did not linger. He knew history never named disruptors kindly while they lived. He carried the photograph of his mother in his pocket. He touched its frayed edges and thought of her silence in the face of indignities he now refused to accept. Her resilience lived in him, but so did her exhaustion. He wondered how long he could endure before the weight became too much. Back at Meridian, resistance grew quieter but sharper. Anonymous leaks reached journalists. Rumors spread of executives plotting to outlast him, to wait until public attention shifted. They spoke of weathering the storm rather than rebuilding the foundation. Jonathan saw it coming. He had spent his life in rooms where people underestimated him. He knew the difference between compliance and concealment.
and he knew this battle was only half fought. As he sat at his hotel desk, revising the next phase of reforms, he understood the truth. He had forced them to face their reflection, but mirrors could be shattered. The real test was not whether Meridian would comply under the world's gaze. The real test was whether it would still comply once the world looked away. The winter sun rose pale over the city, casting long shadows across Meridian Tower. The protests had thinned, but the cameras remained, waiting for either collapse or rebirth. Inside, the building breathed uneasily, caught between the memory of shame and the possibility of change. Jonathan Reed arrived without escort. His steps on the marble echoed softly, the sound steady and unhurried. Employees paused as he passed, no longer whispering as much as before. Some nodded faintly, others simply watched. Suspicion had not vanished, but the fear that once silenced them was loosening. In the boardroom, Evelyn Ward waited. The air carried the sharp tang of fresh polish, as if scrubbing the room could erase the memory of what had unfolded outside its glass walls weeks before. Around the table sat directors weary of scrutiny, executives hollowed by long days of reform. Yet they all turned when Jonathan entered, their eyes following him with the uneasy recognition that power had shifted permanently. Evelyn spoke first. The quarterly review is complete. Complaint reporting has stabilized. Participation is higher than projected. Training sessions are nearly finished. Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table. His expression gave away nothing. And resistance? David Grant cleared his throat. Some remain opposed, but fewer speak it openly. His eyes dropped as if unwilling to meet Jonathan's gaze. Jonathan let silence stretch, forcing the weight of the words to settle. Opposition does not concern me. Concealment does. This institution survives only if what is hidden is brought into light. Robert Lansing shifted uneasily. He wanted to argue, to defend the company's pride, but weeks of scrutiny had eroded his certainty. He said nothing. Evelyn handed Jonathan a binder, its pages filled with charts, audits, compliance reports. We have fulfilled the measures you required. Apex's capital transfer can proceed. Jonathan opened the binder, scanning slowly. Each page reflected weeks of labor. External audits, anonymous reporting logs, independent reviews. Yet he knew documents could only measure intention, not transformation. He closed it gently and looked around the table. What matters is not the paperwork. What matters is whether Meridian understands why this was necessary. No one replied. Their silence betrayed doubt. Jonathan rose from his chair, walking to the window. The skyline glittered beyond the glass, steel and glass rising into pale light. He spoke without turning. You thought survival was numbers, cash reserves, forecasts, capital injections. But survival is dignity. An institution that strips it away collapses even if the ledgers shine. The words hung heavy. Evelyn felt them settle into her bones. She had spent years guarding balance sheets and stock prices, yet she knew he was right. Silence had nearly destroyed them, not loss. Jonathan turned back at last, his eyes steady. Apex will proceed with the partnership, but the real investment is not the money. It is whether Meridian chooses silence again when the cameras fade. The meeting ended not with applause or relief, but with a subdued acknowledgement of inevitability. The directors left quietly, their faces drawn. Evelyn lingered, her voice low. You have changed us, Jonathan. But what about you? When the work is done, what will you carry? For the first time, a shadow crossed his expression. He considered the question carefully. Then he said, I carry the same thing I always have, the cost of silence, and the refusal to accept it. He left the boardroom without waiting for her reply. Across the city, Margaret Hensley packed boxes in the small office of an insurance firm where she had found work. The walls were bare, the carpet worn. She taped the final box and sat for a moment, staring at her reflection in the dark computer screen. Her career in towers of glass was over. She would never again walk the marble corridors she had once patrolled with arrogance. She had learned too late that silence does not protect. It erodes. At Meridian, Jennifer Cho stood before a room of employees, leading a session on inclusive communication. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. She was no longer the woman filming quietly in a hallway. She was the voice guiding others to see what silence hides. The employees listened, some skeptical, some thoughtful. Change, she realized, was not sudden. It was patient, and it was costly. Jonathan left the tower that evening, the city lights shimmering in pools of gold on wet pavement. He walked without hurry, blending into the crowd. Strangers passed him without recognition, unaware that the man at their side had forced an institution to face itself. He preferred it that way. He did not seek applause. He sought permanence. In his hotel, he sat once more by the window, the photograph of his mother in his hands. Her eyes looked out with the same quiet strength he had carried into every room. He whispered her words again, the words that had shaped his life. Never let silence define you. The city stretched beneath him, restless and alive. He knew Meridian would stumble again. All institutions did. But the foundation had shifted. Silence would not hold as easily. And that, he believed, was enough for now. He slid the photograph back into his folder, closed it, and leaned against the chair. Outside, dawn waited beyond the skyline. Inside, one man sat in silence, not defeated, not triumphant, but steady. The negotiation had ended. The transformation had only begun.